This video will explore the idea of elastic provisioning, the whole concept that what you purchase as part of a cloud computing package can grow and shrink and change to meet your needs in a very quick and efficient way. What is elastic provisioning? Well, elastic provisioning refers to the process of automating allocation of computing resources to meet the fluctuating demands of your hosted environment. Now, that's a big mouthful of a definition, but it basically means that, like an elastic band, your computing resources can stretch when you need them to go further and can shrink back when you don't. Many things can be provisioned in an elastic way. Some examples include elastic storage, having more data stored in the cloud when you need it, elastic networking, bigger bandwidth, faster connections, elastic CPU power provisioning, more cores, faster cores, elastic memory, more memory when you need it, elastic virtual machine provisioning, having more virtual machines spun up and running to handle bigger workloads, and then retiring them or removing them when you don't need them. That can be extended to the idea of geolocation elastic site provisioning. Again, a little bit of a mouthful, but taking the idea of not only do we have more virtual machines when we need them, but we move them around, even on a global scale, to where we need them when we need them. Elastic provisioning can bring a lot of benefits to your business once you're invested in the cloud. It gives you the ability to have flexible resources for your platforms or your application available according to your needs on even a moment-by-moment or day-by-day basis. Expanding resources when they're needed and scaling down those resources when they're not needed anymore. Elastic provisioning can also be a way to help maintain high availability or redundant systems at a good price. Can also sometimes help achieve better performance of the application and can give you ways to control cost that you just don't have in a fixed size environment. One example of elastic provisioning that was very common is elastic storage. In the past, storage provisioning was always based on a fixed size of storage being offered. You purchased a certain amount of space. However, all of that provision space was rarely used, and people wanted to provision enough to make sure that they would have space available when they needed it, which meant they were almost always over-provisioning. By using elastic storage provisioning, you only pay for what you use. Now, there's still two ways this can be implemented. Thin provisioning is the idea that the storage hosting providers, or sometimes even the underlying storage systems themselves, allocate more disk space than they actually have available. As long as not all of the storage is being used at once, this is not an issue. In fact, many systems are designed that the physical storage underlying it all can be added to as you get closer and closer, as you become more of the thin provision storage gets used. In other cases, in a cloud or virtualized environment, as the thin provisioning gets close to the physical capacity, some of that workload or some of that storage will simply be shifted off to somewhere else. Conversely, with thick provisioning or fat provisioning, the storage hosting provider or the underlying system itself allocate the exact amount of disk space that is available for that storage platform. The space is then committed to the use for which it's assigned. There may be a different charge level or cost level for thick provisioning over thin provisioning, but there's the security or the feeling and knowledge that that space has been assigned and will always be available when it's needed. Elastic network provisioning is again the same kind of idea. Almost always, network bandwidth capabilities are higher than what we actually consume. With elastic network provisioning, we have the same kind of scalability on our network connections. Network bandwidth capabilities are almost always higher than what we're actually consuming. And in the past, in a non-flexible or non-elastic way, we are charged a fee based on the theoretical bandwidth or the maximum bandwidth, not what is actually being used. With elastic network provisioning, we have more play with our needed bandwidth. If we need more bandwidth for a short period of time, we pay more for what we consume over that short period of time. If our requirements fall back to the normal level, we go back to paying our normal or nominal fee. Your provider can tell you how their provisioning works and whether or not they have any flexibility or elasticity in their networking provisioning as part of their offering. What about the CPU and memory? This is probably the first area where many cloud providers began to go elastic or flexible. The idea behind an elastic CPU or memory provisioning is only applicable in a virtualized environment, where those resources are allocated to virtual machines and, when not in use, shared with other virtual machines. With most virtualizing technologies, resources such as these can be configured as dynamic or static. Depending on the virtualization platform, sometimes the workload will have to be stopped and restarted to move to a larger capacity, and in other cases it's fully dynamic. But let's take an example. Let's say I set up a virtual instance in the cloud that has 4 gigs of memory and a dual-core CPU assigned to it, and I'm using it for an accounting application running on the server. But on the last day of the month, all my invoices are being processed, and I'm under a tremendous load. So I reallocate that server to have 16 gigs of memory and an 8-core CPU. But I only wanted at that capacity for 1 day. And then I go back to the 4 gigs and dual core that I had originally. Many hosting providers make use of pools of resources, or resource pools, for allocating CPU and memory in this elastic way. Carrying on to the idea, we can actually make our virtual machines elastic. By using virtual machine elasticity, you have the possibility to have more virtual machines available for the same application depending on the resource demand. For example, let's say you have a web-based store application running on a single virtual machine. You could choose to have this application stretched over multiple VMs, though, on Black Friday and Cyber Monday and the holiday period. After the holiday rush, you could decrease the load back to a single VM once more. It's important, however, not to confuse elastic virtual machine provisioning with high availability. They can be related and they can use to build off each other, but just being able to stretch across to more machines when you need to does not guarantee that your application is highly available. Geolocation elastic provisioning takes that idea of virtual machine elastic provisioning and stretches a little bit further over multiple locations and even multiple continents. For example, most hosting providers have data centers in different regions, and you can configure your VMs and your services in particular regions. Now, in the Americas, there's a huge frenzy of retail shopping that begins about 6 weeks before the end of the year, between the time of the U.S. Thanksgiving and then Black Friday, Cyber Monday, and on through the holiday season. This is less so the buying pattern in Europe. On the other hand, say the World Cup comes along, and if we were perhaps a sports site, you would find that many more team paraphernalia, souvenirs, gear of that sort is popular in Europe during the World Cup, whereas in the Americas, the World Cup is barely observed. So perhaps during that feeding frenzy at the end of the year in the Americas, I'm so busy over here that I want to have many machines in the US region, because that's where the customers are, that's where the business is. But then that dies off, and at the same time, shortly thereafter, something picks up for an event like the World Cup in Europe. I can take some of those VMs and have them re-provisioned into the European data centers, thus being closest to my users who are there, giving them the most responsive experience possible, because they're not transiting the transatlantic link to get their web results. So I can actually provision my machines right down to the area of the world in which they give me the most benefit. Now, obviously, that's not going to be the case with every small and medium business, but in some cases, it could be a very valuable thing to look at, actually locating those workloads where they're of most benefit to your business and your customers. If geolocation elastic provisioning is a requirement for your business, make sure you check out with your hosting provider to see what they provide and at what cost. So in summary, elastic provisioning is mainly used in virtualized environments. It's commonly available for storage, networking, processing power, and virtual machines themselves, and it can be extended to even be location-based. In most cases, people begin looking at elastic provisioning for budgetary reasons, to control costs, to avoid having to purchase services or supplies or resources that they don't use. So it usually starts as a budget control measure. Beyond that, though, it gives you a way to help it be easier to build applications and services that are more stable, more highly available, and more responsive to your users as your needs change. Hopefully as they grow, but as they change for bigger or for smaller.